Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Wendy Perlman. I'm the Interim Director of the Middle East and North Africa Studies Program here at Northwestern. Welcome to our 5th installment of this speaker series, exploring the early history of Israel and Palestine. The past weeks on our campus and campuses around the United States have shown us how this history cannot be more relevant to the present. Our series aims to empower everyone in our community with the knowledge to navigate these events and understand what is happening both in the Middle East and right here at Northwestern. In our first lecture, Professor Awad Halabi analyzed religious coexistence in late Ottoman Palestine, as well as growing sectarian conflict after World War I. Then, Professor Aryeh Dubnov examined different strands of Zionist thought and mobilization, beginning in mid-19th century Europe. Thirdly, Professor Elizabeth Thompson walked us through the violence of both World War I and the peace that European powers imposed in establishing colonial mandates that divided the Levant into distinct nation states. And then finally, just last week, Dr. Nadim Bawelsa dove into fundamentals of Palestinian nationalism, tracing the development of Palestinian Arabs' national consciousness and mobilization during this era. Videos of all of our talks are or will be available on the Buffett website and YouTube channel.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Maya Nilel, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies. Today, Professor Shay Hazkani will discuss the formative events of the 1948 war, a watershed moment in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Shay Hazkani is Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park. He specializes in social and cultural history of Palestine, Israel. His first book, Dear Palestine, a social history of the 1948 war that was published by Stanford University Press in 2021, was the recipient of the Kornblatt and Israeli Concordia Book Awards and longlisted for the Kandil History Prize. The book is slated to be published in Hebrew and in Arabic in 2024. Shay is also the co-creator of The Soldier's Opinion, a documentary based on his research. The film is the recipient of the 2023 American Historical Association John E. O'Connor Film Award. Shay received his PhD in History and Judaic Studies from New York University, and he holds a Master's in Arab Studies from Georgetown University. Prior to his academic career, Shay worked as a journalist in Israel, covering the occupied Palestinian territories and Israeli military. Shay, thank you so much for coming. The stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Mayan and Wendy, for inviting me, even in those very apocalyptic and sad times. Let me try and get this PowerPoint on. This is a very famous, iconic picture of expulsion of Palestinians from the village of Tantua in 1948. I'll get to talk more about this in this photo in a minute. And I want to really focus on 48, and obviously, I'm sure in the question and answers we'll talk about legacies and connection between the past and the present. But let me actually start with a more current anecdote that connects us to that time of 1948. About a year and a half ago, I got into this public debate on the pages of Israel's most popular tabloid. It's called Yediot Ahronot, with a prominent columnist by the name of Ben-Dror Yamini. He's considered a centrist, whatever that means in current Israeli politics. And like many in the security establishment, he advocating the continuing of Israel's occupation, deemed apartheid, as I'm sure you've heard, by many of the world's leading human rights organizations, including back then the siege of Gaza. And Yamini echoed an Israeli slogan that goes back to the 1950s, known as Ein Brera, which is Hebrew for there's no alternative, meaning that Israel does not wish to inflict this evil on Palestinians, but it is forced to do so because of the nature of its opponent. Now, what drew Yemini's anger at me personally, and it's pretty rare that historians and academics make it to, or have a column written about them in that Israeli tabloid, but he did write a column about me. And the reason he was angry is an article that I published in in another newspaper in Israel known as Haaretz. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. And I said that after a decade-long research into the 48 war, I wanted to share some of my findings in looking in several hundred sources in the Arabic languages. And I said that after reading those sources, I concluded that the most common Israeli claim in 1948 and for decades after of an Arab intention to quote-unquote push Jews into the sea likely did not appear in Arab or Palestinian wartime propaganda. And I added that in fact Israeli wartime propaganda in 48 was far more violent. And the reason Yemini was so upset at me was because a comment that I added to that column where I described as shameful and morally corrupt his decision to start his vastly popular weekly column with a quote-unquote reminder that like in 1948, today as well, Palestinians seek to throw the Jews into the sea and exterminate them. And in the tail end of our uncivil exchange on various newspapers and online platforms, I wrote that Yemini's malicious fabrication of history is more dangerous than many other fabrications since it will make Israeli Jews entrenched in their choice of a regime of Jewish superiority under the assumption that curtain number 2 has genocide in store. And following the apocalyptic Hamas attack of October 7 and the killing of 1,200 Israelis in close-range pogroms, including instances of rape and mutilations, there are very few among Israeli Jews who dispute that axiom, right? That extermination of epic proportion, reminiscent of a Holocaust, right, is around the corner, if not today, tomorrow, if not Hamas, then Hezbollah or Iran or all of them together. And therefore, that's where we are bringing us to the present days, a major public sentiment, sadly, in Israel today, is that only a response in kind in Gaza, which many honestly admit will include and already includes massive ethnic cleansing, perhaps reaching the degree of genocide. As you know, this is very hotly debated, and that will be the only way to restore national honor and deterrence and prevent a supposed second Holocaust from taking place. Now, we're obviously in the midst of that carnage with 35,000 Palestinians killed, up to 10,000 buried under the rubble, famine in the Gaza Strip, and much of the physical space which lays in ruin. And I'm very, very fearful that we haven't seen the worst of that vengeful campaign yet. And more than that, propaganda that was actually used in 48 for the purpose of what authors, and we can talk more about these definitions, have often described as a process of ethnic cleansing, right? We'll talk more about that. That kind of propaganda had sadly reappeared. Palestinians are often described as the descendants of Amalek or the 7 nations of Canaan that the Hebrew Bible commands to destroy and kill, not just them, but their sheep and cattle, etc. But there's actually a major difference in 48 because in 48, there was actually significant dissent against the use of such propaganda. That dissent did not stop what is often called, right, the Nakba or the Palestinian disaster. We'll talk more about that. But it held some hope for a future that is less violent, perhaps a partial reversal of that catastrophe. Today, I would argue, thanks to the entrenchment of the settler movement in Gush Emunim in the West Bank, in religious mainstream Zionist ideology, that entrenchment makes that kind of language and that kind of change or a less violent future less likely. We even heard people like Netanyahu himself quote that language. And in that sense, 2023, 2024 is reminiscent of the 48 war. It rhymes with the 48 wars in ways that I'm sure we'll talk more about in the Q&A. It's not to say that there's a direct linear line leading from 48 to the apocalypse we're in right now, but that it does connect in some larger ways to that story. Now, what I want to do at first is really give us a little bit of a historical background of the 48 war, often referred to in Israel as the War of Independence, right? And you can see here Jews in Israel celebrating the partition decision being adopted by the United Nations in November of 1947. And on the other side of the screen, you can see another iconic picture of expulsion of Palestinians from the war itself, right? And I'm sure most of you know how the war ended, right? The creation, of course, of the State of Israel in May of 1948, and the erasure of what was once Arab Palestine, right? With about 750,000 Palestinians out of 1.4 million that became refugees, and over 500 Palestinian villages which were erased, depopulated, and eventually destroyed. Now, a few years ago, I published a book on the 48 war called Dear Palestine. It's a social and cultural history of the war based on the personal letters of Jews and Palestinians from the war years. And the reason we have those sources is because of this Israeli version of the NSA, this big brother apparatus that secretly intercepted personal letters of Jews and Palestinians and others to give Israeli leaders a capturing of the state of minds of these population. The British are the one that invented this, and they transfer it on to the Israelis in 48. And 17 or more years ago, I was still, I don't always admit it, but a TV correspondent in Israeli television, and sitting in the archives of the Israel Defense Force, it's this fortified compound where I accidentally found that source that I later became this book. And one of the first letters I read by accident, literally, was one that was very impactful for me and ended up, of course, in the book, is this Israeli soldier in the late 50s who is sent to blow up a Palestinian village, right? 500 of those are captured in the war, and over the next decade, they are largely destroyed. Some of them are repurposed for Jewish immigrants, but most of them are destroyed, and he probably was sent to blow up one of those villages, and he walks around the empty villages, and he has this aha moment. Let me read this letter to you, and then we'll go back to some of the history of the war. So this is what he writes in 1959. The surroundings here are full of ruined Arab villages. We were always taught that we won over the Arabs because we love the land more and it's ours. But when I walk around and see all these mountains covered with terraces, I can see it's a lie. Hundreds of years of work were put into every site here. It's unbelievable. There aren't even 50 meters without a terrace, and there are a lot of Caribs. It's hard to grasp this change. People used to live in these ruins. Maybe they loved and hated like we do, and now who knows where they are. And I remember reading this letter, and obviously I was brought up in Israel and a product of the Israeli education system that is very indoctrinational in its nature, and those kind of stories are largely absent from it. I remember reading that letter and thinking, that's very interesting that this soldier has this aha moment. And in Dear Palestine, I sought, among others, to capture some of those voices that gave a different narrative of the war. But what I want to focus here, and the reason why I'm showing this letter, rather than provide you a blow-by-blow of the war, which I find personally incredibly boring and also we don't have the time for, I think the soldier is actually offering us another perhaps method, right? To really maybe try and look at some of the most popular and widespread myths that are associated with the 48 war, and talk a little bit about where research, many others have done incredible research on that, about what does research tell us about this event. Now, before we turn to the war itself, let me give you just a tiny bit about the historical context, and I'm sure you've talked a lot about that in the previous talks, so we'll just sort of refer to some of those early things. First of all, of course, the British mandate in Palestine, right, that starts after the war, the First World War. Now, the entire Middle East and many other areas around the world, but the Middle East especially, right, is sliced up into states and countries of what we know today to be the modern Middle East. And in a lot of those, either a British or a French mandate is established, and most scholars refer to that mandate system as a thinly veiled form of colonial control. However, in the language of those mandates, there's always a kind of rendering that eventually the British, the French, would help the native population reach the stage of human development, so to speak, and become independent, right? That's what happens in Syria and in Lebanon, to a lesser degree in Iraq, and even to a lesser degree in Egypt, but that's the kind of language that exists. In Palestine, where the British established their mandate in the aftermath of World War I, you have the Balfour Declaration, right, baked into the Mandate Charter, right? The Balfour Declaration that promises that basically the British will give sponsorship to the Zionist movement in establishing of something, some sort of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And at that time, right, of the Balfour Declaration, Jews are about 8% of the population. The vast majority, non-Zionist. It's not that they're anti-Zionist necessarily, but 92% of the population are Muslim and Christian Arabs. We happen to know what they had in mind because the Americans, for all sorts of reasons, send a commission of inquiry that collects what we could probably say today is sort of the public opinion of the population, and the population, not just in Palestine, but in the region as a whole, is overwhelmingly against this idea of British sponsorship of Zionism. So the British mandate, as it's established, right, is already a little bit fishy, so to speak, in the eyes of most, the 92% of the population that is Christian or Muslim Arab. And that means that many of them are somewhat reluctant to cooperate with the British, and are, you know, in a very odd position where they have to decide of whether they are working together with a foreign colonial rule that is trying to establish in the country that they see themselves as the indigenous population, obviously, another sort of entity. And so that's the context, right? And throughout the 20s and 30s and 40s, the British are in Palestine largely in the context of sponsoring the Zionist movement. Now that's interesting because in Israel, for those who happen to have been brought up there or otherwise in some forms of Jewish education in this country, it's often presented that the Zionist movement was a quote-unquote anti-colonial movement and rebelled against the British to claim its own independence. Now, like all stories, there is a modular part of truth here in the sense that by the late 40s, and even throughout the 40s, all of them, the British changed their mind, and there are some militant groups from within the Zionist movement that launch attacks against the British. And so, but that is a very, very, very short time span within that larger British period. And so seeing the Zionist movement as an anti-colonial movement, the way it's often presented in the Israeli context, I think is something with very little basis. And of course, and we can talk more about that in our discussion, a much more relevant context is looking at Zionism itself as a form of a settler colonial movement, or at least partial settler colonial movement, within the British larger imperial context. And we can talk more about that later on. Now, this is, of course, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Israeli Jewish community in Palestine and the head of the labor movement there, right? He wasn't, there were several major leaders before him, but by the time of the 1930s, he emerges as the most able and prominent leader in the Zionist movement. Now, many ask, in the context of what we know, the 48 war, right, the massive expulsion and fleeing of Palestinians, how significant was this idea of expelling Palestinians or transferring them, as it's often called in a sort of euphemistic way, how central it was to Zionist ideology. And that's a question that historians often argue about. Certainly within the Zionist movement, both on the quote-unquote left, right, the Ben-Gurion and some of his colleagues, and on the right, on the revisionist movement, there were extensive discussion that the solution for, quote-unquote, the Jewish problem in Palestine would be transferring forcibly the Arab population. And that kind of ideas are circulating especially by the late 30s, because the British themselves are inclined for such a violent solution. However, most historians would argue that that idea was just one circulating in the Zionist movement, and not certainly in the stated policy of the labor movement. That's not the kind of ideology that ended up making it into policy papers. Whether Ben-Gurion and others harbored that idea secretly, obviously we can't tell, but at least in public, that's not the language that was being used. So this is the leader of the Zionist movement into the 30s and 40s. And of course, this is another very famous proponent of this era, Amin al-Husseini, the leader of the Palestinian national movement. And I'm sure you've heard the stories that are largely true about his connections and alliance with Nazi Germany. Now, he has an interesting story, right? He's brought up by the British, by Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner in Palestine, who was a British Jewish person with much support for Zionism. And he installs him under the assumption that he will be easy to manipulate and easy to control. And throughout the 20s, generally they are able to sort of influence Amin al-Husseini, who is appointed to a major position known as the head of the Muslim Council in Palestine. But by the 30s, right, Amin al-Husseini makes his own political calculation and decides that leading the Palestinian revolt against the British would garner much more support for him, and basically joins the resistance against both the British and the Zionists in Palestine. A word on his affiliation with Nazi Germany, right? By the 30s, he's already kicked out of Palestine by the British. He travels around the world and he ends up in Berlin. In that, he is actually not that different than many leaders of anti-colonial movement at the time, right? It's gonna be strange to hear right now, but of course, in the 30s and even as late as the early 40s, Nazi Germany had presented itself as supporter for anti-colonial movement. And so you had Indian and Yugoslavian and many, many other leaders congregate in Berlin under the thinking that Nazi Germany would help them break loose from the yoke of British imperialism. And that's what brings initially Amin al-Husseini and some others to Germany. In the Palestinian national movement, many are opposed also to Nazi Germany. Many are also opposed to Nazism, but certainly not Amin al-Husseini. And scholars have also speculated and gathered some evidence about his knowing of the Nazi extermination campaign and perhaps his willingness to participate or work with the Nazis in this context. And obviously this picture has been used extensively in an attempt to discredit the entirety of the Palestinian movement. We should also remember, by the way, that in the revisionist wing of the Zionist movement, there are also those that are reaching out to Nazi Germany, certainly to fascist Italy, and see those as all sorts of role models for possible development, right? Amin al-Husseini had his own sort of anti-Semitic inclination and later broadcasted in propaganda, but this idea of collaborating and working together with Nazi Germany was not completely out of the realm of possibility for both certainly Zionist and Arab nationalists at the time. This brings us to the 36-39 Arab Revolt in Palestine. At the time, it's the world's largest and most significant anti-colonial revolt in the world. And it starts in the countryside in Palestine, but ends up eventually making its way to the urban areas. And it's a revolt both against the British, who are sponsoring Zionist immigration into the country, and largely sponsoring the colonization of more land, right? At that point, there's a massive crisis of landlessness among Palestinian peasants or farmers that is believed to be connected to the spark of this revolt. The British have a really hard time suppressing this revolt. They bring the Royal Air Force and massive forces into Palestine. And in fact, one of the things that they do, and we saw that happen again and again in the decades after, they bomb from the air, right? The Royal Air Force bombs Palestinian villages from the air in an attempt to suppress this revolt. 3,800 Palestinians are killed by the British, another 1,200 are killed by Palestinians themselves in internal fighting within the Palestinian elites. Several hundred Jews are killed as well in the context of this revolt. Eventually, the revolt is crushed by the British, but at both financial expense and military expense that they could not have imagined. And that's really where most historians signal at the point where the British are starting to have a second thought about their idea of sponsoring the Zionist movement in Palestine, right? Zionist colonization, the creation of more and more Zionist settlement in the country. Again, the demographics are still overwhelmingly Arab at the time. We don't have, let me see when we have some more, the next time we have statistics is 1931. Jews are about 20% of the country. Arabs, Christians, and Muslim are about 80%. By the late 30s and early 1940s, of course, in the context of the Second World War, the British are gradually starting to talk about moving away from this Palestine problem, right? Letting the Jews and the Arabs of the country kill themselves and be killed, etc. And there are all sorts of reasons that historians talk about when they think about why the British decide to disengage eventually. Why they decide in 1947 to refer the Palestine problem or question to the United Nations. Obviously, in the context of the post-World War II era, the British are in what's often called an imperial overstretch. They have a very hard time keeping to their colonies overseas. The most place that interests them is, of course, India. They also cannot reach an agreement with the US as to the future of Palestine. And most importantly, they are fearful of another Arab revolt. And so the thought that they will have to invest military powers in order to suppress such a revolt. And in 1947, they refer the Palestine question, so to speak, to the newly created United Nations. The United Nations forms a committee. It's called UN Scope, and it comes to the country, surveys it, holds all these discussions and debates among its various representatives, which are legal scholars from around the world, mostly from Western countries, but some Indian and others are involved as well. And the Palestinians, they say, you know, we're the majority in this country, right? We want the Palestine question to be solved based on the UN Charter, meaning Zionism is a settler colonial movement or a colonial movement. We are the majority in this country, and therefore it should be an Arab state, and they will not cooperate with UN Scope as it comes to survey the land, although some members secretly give testimonies. Eventually, the UN Commission, and you can see, by the way, how the countries, like the Jewish settlements, are, you know, they're significant already. Jews are about a third of the population at this point, but Jews only own about 8% of the land, privately own 8% of the land on the eve of partition. And UN Scope basically comes up with a recommendation, right? They submitted to the United Nations General Assembly. This is the famous Partition Plan. And let me say a word or two on that Partition Plan because it informs a lot of the current discussions and debates. Basically, what the UN Commission recommends is that the Arab Palestinian population, there are 2/3 of the population. According to the plan, they were supposed to receive 43%, that's the area here in yellow, for an Arab state. And that state, would have about, I think, 1% Jewish minority, right? Because at that point, forceful population exchange, transfer was already out of the question in the context of the aftermath of the Second World War. The plan designated that the Jews, that are 1/3 of the population, as I mentioned, own 8% of the land, will get 56% of the territory, here in orange, but that Jewish state will have a minority of 45% Arab population. The idea was that waves of Jewish immigration will change that demographic balance. Jerusalem and Bethlehem were supposed to be international zones under UN supervision. And so, here we go. So this is the famous partition plan. The plan is rejected by the Palestinian leadership and the Arab states. And the Yishuv, the Jewish community under Ben Gurion, accepts it. Now, here also historians talk and debate a lot about that decision of the Palestinian and Arab leadership to reject and of the Jews to accept. Most scholars argue that the Yishuv under Ben Gurion had the intelligence that it will be rejected by the Arab side and therefore decided to accept it under the thinking that during the war itself, they will be able to take over territory that was designated for an Arab state, which actually does happen. The 1948 war starts the day after, right, the partition plan is adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. That vote takes place on 29th of November of 1947. The Declaration of Independence of Israel only is in May, but the war actually starts already on the 30th of November. The war itself lasts about 20 months. And of course, it results, as I mentioned, the permanent displacement of 3/4 of Palestine's Arab population from their homes. A Jewish state was established over 80% of the territory of Mandate Palestine. And of course, the Arab state was never created. So that's some of the historical context. And I want to now quickly tackle some of the most significant myths that have certainly held sway in Western public opinion, also in the Israeli context for many, many decades until the 1980s. The number one myth has to do with Arab unity. So after the war that starts on November 30th, 1947, is an intercommunal war. The Palestinians are assisted by an army of volunteers from around the Arab world, a small army of about 5,000 people, but it's largely contained within Palestine. The Jews, who are 628,000 at the time, are assisted by Jewish volunteers coming from around the world. We'll talk more about these volunteers in a minute. But after the Declaration of Independence of Israel that takes place on the day that the British are set to leave the country, right? They're set to leave on May 15. The Declaration of Independence takes place on May 14. The day after, we see the invasion of Arab armies into Palestine, right? The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, sort of, and also a small force of the Iraqi army. One of the ways that the second part of the war was often described was of sort of a unified Arab force of those major Arab countries together trying to eliminate the newly created state of Israel, etc. What historians, especially from the 80s, had shown us that there was very little unity within that Arab camp in 1948. So Jordan, it was called Transjordan at the time, was secretly negotiating with Israel for many decades, right? So Jordan as a country is a creation of the British Empire. The British bring in a dynasty that originates in the Arabian Peninsula and basically creates Transjordan much earlier than that. But Jordan is, as it's called later, its army, known as the Arab Legion, is the most strongest Arab army at the time, but it is commanded by a British officer, and all the upper echelon of the officers in that army are British. And they answer both to the British and to the Transjordanian King Abdullah at the time. And throughout the 30s and 40s, they secretly negotiate with the Zionist movement, later with Israel, talking about all sorts of ideas of maybe joining the countries together, or maybe creating some sort of sponsorship of a Palestinian state. On the eve of the 48 war, they're also negotiating about this idea that they may not fight each other, that they may conclude a secret agreement where Jordan will be allowed to take over what is known today as the West Bank of the Jordan River in return for sort of almost or very minimally engaging with the Israeli forces. The agreement does not end up being concluded. However, historian Avi Schleim, among others, have suggested that during the war, the only places where significant fighting between the Arab Legion and the Israeli forces takes place is over Jerusalem. Israeli forces are trying to take that area, in which they do eventually, or the western part of Jerusalem, which was supposed to be an international zone. And so the idea is that only relatively the fighting with the Jordanian army is not as broad, and the Jordanians are not really interested in any Arab unity or an Arab attempt to defeat the Zionist movement or Israel. Syria has its own issue. The Syrian President Shukri al-Kawakli is very concerned about Abdallah taking over parts of Arab Palestine and possibly trying to take over Syria itself. And so one of his major motivations in the war, although the Syrian forces do fight, especially in northern Palestine, the area of the Galilee, but a major concern of his is sort of blocking his rival, King Abdallah of Egypt. The Egyptians are also a significant military force. They fight mostly in the contained area of the Negev, right, where they invade the country. But the point that several historians have tried to make is that that story of Arab unity is largely a flawed one, in the sense that each of those countries were fighting for its own domestic agendas. Not only that, that they were also not fighting in a coordinated manner, and that most of their armies were not really invested in the war, right? When we look at 1948, the Arab world is about 80 million people. The Jewish Yishuv is 628,000. And so often, another myth that was often circulating for many decades is this supposed few against many. And if you look at the population figures, indeed, one could suggest this is a situation of a few against many. However, again, scholars in recent decades have shown that the height of the war, that's in September and October of 48, there were 88,000 Jewish soldiers fighting about 68 or so thousand Arab soldiers from all Arab armies and Palestinians combined. And so, therefore, this situation of a few against many that is often still repeated in the context of the 48 war is at least, at minimum, a non-accurate one. And this brings us to the most enduring and important legacy, of course, of the war, the quote-unquote exodus of 750,000 Palestinians and the capturing of 500 Palestinian villages. Again, one of the most significant myths that had held for many, many decades, both in Israel and outside, is the story of those Palestinians supposedly living at their own accord after the calls of their Arab leaders. And it's important to note that already in 1949, at the conclusion of this war, Palestinians were telling their story, right? We're saying, we were expelled from this country in 1948, forcibly put on bus and driven across the border. But even though those testimonies were in circulation, they didn't make much of a headway, certainly not in English and French-speaking countries. And so that kind of myth of Arab leaders calling Palestinians to leave was relatively hegemonic, shockingly, up until the 80s, even though since then scholars have argued that there's essentially no recorded calls by Arab or Palestinian leaders for Palestinians to leave or anything of that sort. In the 1980s, a group of Israeli Jewish historians known as the New Historians started using the newly opened Israeli archives to find Israeli Defense Forces documents, IDF documents, and documents by the Israeli government that were actually themselves telling what Palestinians have long argued, right? That in 1948, a massive expulsion or fleeing was induced by the Jewish forces, but this time this story was being told using Israeli sources and documents. And on a gradual process throughout the 80s and 90s, those new historians, the most famous of which you may have heard the name is Benny Morris, those narratives began to change both in this country and in English and French-speaking areas and countries. But there was some very interesting and important debate that developed, because Benny Morris argues, yeah, it's true that Israel holds a major responsibility for the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem. However, he claimed that the Palestinian refugee problem was born, and I'm quoting him, by war and not by design. Meaning, he argues that it's not that Ben-Gurion and other in the Israeli leadership had ordered their military commanders to take over Palestinian villages and expel their population in a form of organized and orchestrated ethnic cleansing, but rather, he argued, this was something that developed sort of with no rhyme or reason, meaning not in an orchestrated manner throughout the war. Other historians have disputed that argument, and had basically said, we may or may not have that kind of a smoking gun, right? Ben-Gurion, historians have not been able to unearth a direct order by him to expel Palestinians, but those scholars and historians say that the overwhelming other evidence that we do have suggests that this was an orchestrated form of ethnic cleansing, even if the written commands kept a certain, let's call it civil language in real time. One document that those historians that dispute Benny Morris's claim point to is something known as Plan D, which was a plan by the Haganah, right? That was the predecessor of the IDF. In March of 48, they published the fourth iteration of their war plans. And that language that plan, it's a very lengthy plan, has the following paragraph. It says that during the war, there could be destruction of villages, including setting fire to, blowing up, and planting mines in the debris, especially those population centers which are difficult to control continuously. Now, some historians argued that this command, as part of this very famous Plan D document, constitute as a blueprint for the expulsion of Palestinians. Personally, I'm not sure that this is the kind of smoking gun that historians are looking for. That smoking gun may exist. Israel still holds a lot of the files from the 48 war classified, and I'm happy to talk more about that in our discussion, but at least that kind of document, in my sense, have not yet surfaced. Nevertheless, let's look at the numbers for a second, because today we have a very good grasp of what happens in each part of the country, right? And so if you'd like, if we look at the Nakba in numbers, with respect to the Palestinian villages, in 54.4%, Palestinians fled as a result of Jewish military assaults, meaning Israeli army went into Palestinian villages, started shooting, oftentimes killing civilians in instances of massacres, etc., causing the population to flee. That happens in 54% of the cases. In 24.6%, Jewish forces forcibly expelled Palestinians, meaning took the civilian population, put them on buses and trucks, and drove them beyond the Israeli borders. And then in about 10%, Palestinians fled because of the influence of the fall of nearby villages, meaning people hear what happens in a nearby locality and decide to leave as a result. In 7.7%, a general fear of Jewish attack was the underlying cause for departure. In 2.4%, psychological warfare by Jewish forces spurred the exodus, and oftentimes loudspeakers were used in order to try and convince the population to leave those villages. And in about 1%, Palestinians left because they were ordered to do so by other Arab political or military leaders. And that's how sort of the war ends. Now, there are some other Israeli historians that try to tell a more complicated story. They're saying, there's no smoking gun. For example, Hillel Cohen, who is today probably the most important historian of the Zionist movement, he says we should really not see 1948 war as one war. And he argues that from November up until, let's say, the end of May, we should see it as sort of one separate part of the war, and then starting June all the way to the end of the war in March of 1949 is a different story altogether. And he argues that the first part of the war was largely defensive, meaning Arab forces who launched attacks against Jewish settlements, for example, Mishmar HaEmek and others, the attacks were fended off, and then in retaliation, Jewish forces sometimes took over the surrounding Palestinian villages and expelled their inhabitants, however, on a relatively small scale. He argues that in the second part of the war, there was much more massive, planned form of ethnic cleansing, especially in two operations, Hiram and Chorev, in the later parts of the war, where Israel undoubtedly had the upper hand militarily, nevertheless sort of used that momentum of the war to basically re-engineer the demographics of the country. I think he makes some compelling cases, but I'm not sure that within such a short time span of 20 months, you can really say, one ideology prevails in the beginning and another at the end, but I did want to share with you some more sort of nuanced perspective than the one offered by Morris. Now, to wrap up, I already gave you a sense that in my own research of the 48 war, I'm not as interested in the Ben-Gurions and Amin al-Husseinis, because I really think that what ordinary people had in mind and the way that they perceived reality in some way is much more important and more interesting. Not in a romantic sense, right? And some of those letters that I work on in my book are very harsh, but I wanted to give you a sense of one or two letters, one by Jewish Israeli soldiers, by American Jewish volunteers, and then by Palestinians responding to their expulsion from the country. One of the letters that I want to present to you briefly is by a Jewish female soldier that witnessed very significant and gory sort of war crimes during the war. And she witnessing those, and I'm not going to take you into the gory details themselves, but she witnessed the torture and eventually burning alive of a Syrian officer in the northern front. And that makes her reflect on the question of what she talks about, sort of being Jewish in the national era, right? And she writes something that's really interesting that I think connects to some larger questions that many of those immigrants to Palestine at the time were talking about in their letters. So let me give you a sense of the letter, and then we can talk about what at least I read in her pontifications. So this is what she writes. Okay, that's the 48 war, that we've covered that. That's the map of the end of the war, the way that the state of Israel, it looks like at the end of the war without the West Bank and Gaza. Let me give you a glimpse of those letters. This is what she says. I think that if the Jewish guys are expected to fight and murder legitimately like the soldiers of other nations, they too should be allowed to erupt and kill just like that out of revenge and pleasure. At first it was hard for me to believe and get used to the idea that a Jewish soldier from a good kosher home can abuse people in such a horrific way. The last battles had taught me a lot and opened my eyes. Now, this is a very interesting letter, and there are others that I look at the book of similar theme, because stating that this soldier is really talking about this idea that Jews should be like all other nations. And by doing so, she's making an ideological choice in one of the oldest debates inside the Zionist movement that dates back to the late 19th century. It's then that we find these two distinct trends. One that sided with Jews becoming a nation like all other nations, Hebrew kechol hagoyim, and the core idea there is to imitate the populist, chauvinist nationalism that was so popular in Europe at the turn of the century, and among other things, sort of celebrate the use of force. Now, the other strand that was often referred to as light onto nation, or ol hagoyim, it's a verse from Isaiah, is this idea that Jews should openly reject the use of force as means of advancing Zionist goals, and instead emphasize the moral aspects of Judaism and what its adherents saw as the supposed universal message that Judaism had, that light onto nation. And by stating that the battles had opened her eyes, it would seem that the writer sort of came to accept the view that violence was constitutive to the creation of a new Jewish nation. And indeed, for many, 48, for many Jews certainly, was this return to history, which is another Zionist concept from the late 19th century that argued that only modern Jewish nationalism could allow Jews to transcend 2 millennia of supposed passivity and bring them back into Western history. This was very appealing for some. Here's an example of one American Jewish volunteer who came to fight in 48. And this is what he writes. We're making history on a grandiose scale, but in an astonishingly short time. A group of devoted daydreamers full of belief in an army which started as a group of partisans succeeded to generate a revolution, one bigger than what 2,000 years of misery, prayers, bribery, quips, and humiliation have managed to do. And so, that was a very common sentiment, right? This idea that, the creation of a Jewish state had, in a sort of one swift move, brought Jews back to history. But that was not everyone's view, and there was significant dissent that rose up in 1948. I like this next letter very much because I do think it echoes in some of those tensions that we're seeing these days between the younger generation of American Jews in this country and the state of Israel in the context of what is going on in Gaza. So this is an American Jewish volunteer who came to fight in 48. This is the letter he sent home. It was intercepted by Israel, and the writer says, he wants to leave Israel right away and not settle there as he originally planned. And this is what he writes. Israel would win the war, it should win, and it would win, because this is a just cause, although the people representing it are not worthy to play this historical role. a golem is being formed here, and no one knows how it would turn out when it grows. And we American Jews helped to create this golem, but without having any say on its moves. At any rate, the Jews of Israel abandoned their religion for a revolver in every respect. And so this is very, very interesting. And for those not familiar with the golem story, this is sort of this mythical creature that believed to be artificially created by European Jews in the Middle Ages to protect their communities at a time of need, sort of a Frankenstein-like creature. The most famous story is connected with a famous rabbi from Prague, who in the 16th century created this creature after he had heard that his community is about to be attacked. The golem does protect the Jews of Prague. However, it then starts to run wild, sort of attacking innocent bystanders. And so to this soldier we just quoted, Israel was such a golem, right? A tool ostensibly created for the purpose of protecting Jews, but then unleashing this unchecked violence against innocent bystanders. And so for him, this idea that Jews should be a nation like all other nations and adopt what he saw as the gentle way of war was totally unacceptable. And let me quickly wrap up because I know I'm already out of time. I wanted to give a glimpse, at least, of this letters by Palestinians in 1948, 1949. They're really interesting in, for their own sake. For obviously Palestinians, the immediate aftermath of the Nakba did not only bring material loss and displacement, also depression and grief. And many Palestinians at that time realized that the failure of the old leadership to quote-unquote liberate Palestine means that they will have to take on the mantle of reversing 1948, right? And so many of them start this very significant grassroots campaign of return. On the one hand, they start rejecting the old leadership that had failed them in such a way. And on the other way, they are starting to, in very concrete ways, talking about a return to their former villages, even if that meant living under Israel's rule. And I'll just give one example, because I know we have to wrap up, right? So you suddenly have this situation where 750,000 become refugees, and 150,000 Palestinians remain in Israel and become Israeli citizens in 1949. But the families are now split, and those in these newly created refugee camps all around Israel and Arab countries, as well as the West Bank and Gaza, right? The Gaza Strip, as we know it today, is a creation of the 48 war, right? The armistice lines are what creates this strip. Gaza City existed before, a small, thinly populated area, but at the conclusion of the war, Palestinians that are expelled from al-Husseini and Majdal and all those areas in the Negev area end up in the Gaza Strip, and you have these families writing back and forth. They're now split. And so by 1949, many Palestinians realized that the return to Palestine at that point could only be facilitated by their family members who now became Israeli citizens. Now, for the majority of Palestinians who were unable to obtain the Israeli government permission for the return of their loved ones, calling their families to sneak across the border into Israel was the only way of reuniting with their loved ones. But of course, not all Palestinians were easily convinced to let smugglers bring them back home. Here's a letter by a female Palestinian to her family who ended up in Transjordan. This is what she writes. That's not this one. How is our dear father, and why doesn't he listen to what I say and take my advice? After all, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Read him my words. As long as the movement of people continues between Arab states and Israel, and others are paying thousands of liras to do it, why did your feelings die and your right mind disappear? Of course, Israel had made the attempt to block this return, its central policy in the aftermath of the war, in some ways until today. Letters of Palestinians, like the one I just read to you, were often intercepted by Israel and were used to uncover routes that were used by Palestinians trying to smuggle the border into what now became Israel. These Palestinians were often ambushed as they tried to return. Countless were arrested and expelled a second time. And between 1949, the conclusion of the war, and 1956, between 2,700 and 5,000 Palestinians were shot and killed as they tried to cross into Israel. A small fraction of that number were Palestinian militia forces who sought to go into Israel for sabotage purposes. Now, the aspiration to reverse 1948 still drives, of course, the Palestinian national movement, and the desire to guarantee that the results of the 48 war holds is, of course, at the center of much of Israeli policies. Now, it would seem that we're in the midst of what I think could be described as a second Nakba, and in fact, Israeli Minister Avi Dichter had called this, right, the Gaza Nakba, what we're seeing today. I think that many in the Israeli political system, and especially in the settler movement, see what is going on now as a sort of an opportunity to complete the kind of ethnic cleansing, although that word, of course, did not exist in real time, but is often used to describe the 48 war. They see it as an opportunity to complete that in a way that was not possible in 48. This route will undoubtedly mean a bloodbath for both Palestinians and Israelis for the foreseeable future, and which I fear is a very possible scenario. Of course, it's very, very hard to see what the future holds, but I think that's a possibility that we should really be concerned about right now. Happy to answer any questions about 48 or connections to the present. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Shai, for this comprehensive and thought-provoking talk. We'll open the floor now for questions. So please, yes, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was wondering if you could say something also about the other exodus or expulsion post-1948 of Jews from Arab countries and how that fits into the broader narrative.
Yeah, absolutely, and I should say that is a topic that I research as well, especially Moroccan Jews, right? So the Jewish population in the Arab world in North Africa consisted of a little under 1 million, probably 800,000 and 900,000 people in 1948. By the mid-60s, the overwhelming majority of those, I don't know what the issue is with the mic, I apologize. The overwhelming majority of those end up in Israel. The question is, and it's an immensely important story, the question is whether or how much it relates to 1948. Because while the Palestinians are being forced out or flee under the duress of the Israeli army, Jews in Arab countries live on all sorts of circumstances. Some are pushed out. But for example, the largest majority of those Jews, 250,000 in Morocco, do not suffer certainly the kind of persecution or expelled in that kind of manner, right? And in fact, 1948 is not such an eventful episode for them. The vast majority only leave in the 60s under a very, very different context of the decolonization of Morocco itself. Morocco is granted independence by France in 1956, and that's the context in which they live. Now, the Jews of Iraq certainly are pushed out to a degree, but by a coordination between the Iraqi government, an anti-Semitic Arab nationalist government, but also a major British ally, but also with Israel's pulling some of the strings and organizing direct flights from Iraq to Israel. My point is that the story of the Jews in the Arab lands is an important, immensely important story. These people are entitled to, of course, their property, etc., etc. And it's a story that connects to the larger story of Israel-Palestine. But what I'm more concerned of is initiatives that are very common in Israel in the last few decades, but you can find them already in the 50s, to sort of suggest that the two balance each other out. They do not. They're not really in fundamental ways connected. This is a story of Palestinians and the Israeli states. This is a story of Arab states that have an immense debt, and shame on them for causing the Jews in their country either to be expelled or otherwise leave. But the stories are not necessarily, in my view at least, are sort of necessarily the part of that same basket. I know we sort of covered many decades in a short answer, but the point is that those do not balance each other out, right? The Palestinians, the vast majority were expelled or fled, and their property later confiscated, etc. That's one story that will not go away. The story of the Jewish property in Arab states and the story of the Jews there, that's another story that will not go away. But the two do not necessarily make this okay or this okay, and looking at them in tandem is tricky in the sense that there are two different narratives that have obviously some lines of connection to them, but are not bringing us any closer to the whatever resolution of Israel-Palestine or a better, less violent future.
Thank you so much for giving me to talk. I know we are not, thank you. I know that we are analyzing historical moves and historical developments, but I'm wondering, what do you make of the fact that a big reason for Jews to immigrate to Palestine at the end of the 19th century, mostly the first decades of the 20th century, are the pogroms, the persecution that were ongoing for centuries. But then this, of course, is combined with the general national movements that come up in Europe, but specifically the story of the Jews in there, and also taking into account that Zionism itself as an ideology, right, by Theodor Herzl, even though he also considered Uganda in Africa, but came out of the idea of how to find a solution for Jews as they are persecuted all over Europe. Thank you.
I just want to make sure I understand. What do I make? I mean, you stated sound historical effect. You mean in the context, if I understand correctly, of sort of looking at Zionism, for example, as what is a settler colonial movement? Does it negate that question? Just to make sure I understand the question correctly.
What I'm trying to say, as of course you shared with us, there are many problematic and terrible wrongdoings that were made, right? We talk about in dry language, but of course this is very disturbing. I'm wondering if you think there is anything to consider in terms of the background of these events. That's what I'm saying. I know we are not here to judge morally things that doesn't make them relative or the suffering relative in any way, but I'm just wondering, how do you look at this factor?
So these, I mean, they're certainly important contexts, right? I mean, the question on whether or not they, for example, weaken the analysis of Zionism as a settler colonial movement, for example, the way French were in Algeria or the way this country was established. Certainly, some have argued that it does, but of course, when we look at the question of, let's, for the sake of argument, argue that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, right? Although it does not have a metropole like the French settlers had in Algeria, that they had, of course, France as a metropole. Obviously, Zionism is not the same kind of story, but it does have that sort of British, European sponsorship, etc. It does try to change the demographic balance. And so let's say for the sake of argument that Zionism should be analyzed also as a settler colonial movement. And so the question of them, the Jews did not have a metropole, and many of them do arrive in the country as destitute refugees, right? Holocaust survivors, survivors of pogrom, etc., etc. That's not how the movement starts, and we can talk about that separately in the context of the late 19th century, but certainly by the 20th century, that's the case. And so that means that, the fact that Zionism is a settler colonial movement, it does not correspond, for example, with the Algerian case in the sense that, there's no metropole and there's no quote-unquote question of Jews returning. That's not possible, right? And so that kind of very violent also trajectory of the Algerian case is not necessarily relevant. But this country is also based largely on settler colonial institutions and immigration, and South Africa was as well, right? And the question is not whether or not settler colonialism is a crucial part of analyzing the movement that then birthed the state, but whether or not that is the practice in our current reality. I would argue that certainly Zionism should be analyzed in the framework of settler colonialism, but much more importantly, that modern Israel is on that trajectory, right? The settler movement in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, right? The expropriation of most lands that were not owned by Jews in the aftermath of the 48 war, meaning that the state of Israel, and even increasingly so in the last few decades, have gone on that track. And, Israel, quote unquote, has this ancestral sin, quote unquote, but many countries do. And the question is how they grapple with it and what they do sort of moving on, how they're trying to resolve these, how they're trying to make amends for that. I don't think we've seen much of that in Israel's history. And so the context that you're referring to is, of course, an important one, because it means that even if we are to look at Zionism as a settler colonial movement in Israel, as the creation of a movement that is also a settler colonial movement, that, there's no, the settlers, they will not go away, they will not go back to some other place, and that is a reality that is a very, very, very crucial and important one for the envisioning of a future, right? A less violent future, but a future that also takes into consideration the past and the 48 war and the decades earlier. I hope I answered it, but if there's, you want to ask a more specific question, I'd love to answer that as well.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I was very intrigued by the accidental discovery of the letters. Can you tell us more about how that happened and what ensued, and what is the general status of the documents? Because coming from a Soviet Union background, the archives were open. Some of the archives were open for only a short period of time, and then they were closed again there, so I wonder what are the parallels.
Yeah, thank you so much. And the question of archival access is something that I've been very interested in for a long period of time. I even went to the Israeli Supreme Court against the Israeli Secret Service, the Shin Bet, trying to get them to open their archives to the public, and well, spoiler alert, that the Supreme Court did not allow this. But those sources, I remember reading it for the first time. I gave you one of the letters I read. They were really captivating because they told a different narrative that I was familiar with about not only Israel's creation, but also Ashkenazi Mizrahi relations, Palestinians, and many, many, many other themes in Israeli history. That apparatus that copied personal letters existed in Israel from 1948 all the way to 2004. So in 1998, they stopped reading the letters of soldiers, but they did continue reading the letters of civilians and Palestinians all the way to 2004 when, well, people stopped sending letters, and so it basically made no sense to continue reading them. But it was a very interesting and important tool for Israeli decision makers not to spy on individuals, although that was done as well. So, this later became a documentary film that was mentioned earlier, and we showed that personal letters were also used to identify and target homosexuals and, kick them out of the army or all sorts of things like that. And so certainly individuals were also targeted, but that's not the point that though that institution had, more largely speaking. The point there was to get the state of mind of population at large. What do Moroccan Jews think about Ben Gurion? What do Palestinians think about return? What do Russian Jews think about the Soviet Union, etc., etc.? And there is massive, every 2 weeks, that apparatus that's called the postal censorship puts out these reports looking at whatever the target population was, their personal letters, giving some of the letters, but trying to extract some sociological data from that. That's not an Israeli invention, and it's important to stress, right? So, the US have done that until World War II, the British certainly, the Russians as well. And in fact, what I try to do a little bit in the book is compare between these apparatuses around the world. So, but in the Russian case, oftentimes this apparatus, those officers working there were very concerned and scared of their superiors and the political leaders. And so they only pushed forward letters that were already in line with what the political leadership was thinking. But that's not the case in Israel, right? Under sort of British guidelines and some British ethos of how these civil servants should be working, they really worked hard to keep their independence. And so because of that, as a historian, of course, we're really fortunate to find these unbelievable, incredible sources of those personal letters that can tell us, I think, very different stories about narratives and periods that we think we already know very well. And that's what I try to do in the book.
And if I may add, there is an academic documentary called The Soldier's Opinion based on Shay's research, so I strongly recommend to watch this fascinating documentary. Yes, please.
You talked about the control of the narrative.
It's being recorded.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right, great. Yeah, because there's so much feedback. But you talked about the control of the narrative, and I would even argue that maybe some of the questions that you're getting here have to do with that control of the narrative. Do you see any prospect within Israel for seeing things maybe from the perspective that you bring as a historian and maybe preventing what's currently unfolding?
Yeah, it's always challenging for me to, although I've been here for quite a few years, but to give talks, because people often are looking for an optimistic take on reality. And, I'm guilty of that as well. I made this book into a documentary that was aired on Israeli television, and the book is coming out now in Hebrew in Israel, and we'll give it for free to teachers and educators in Israel because we received a grant for that purpose. But that's not where things are, sadly. And, I always say that I see that the Palestine cause, that, I feel strongly for, is making some very significant headway and changes here in this country that I never believed that I will see in my lifetime. That's the cause. The place itself is sadly deteriorating, and at this point looking, and obviously I left my crystal ball in Washington, D.C., but I think it's likely that we will see this turn into a bloodbath for the rest of our lifetime. And so, the short answer that I don't see that, but I am surprised every day again and again. So hopefully I will be proven wrong on your question as well.
Thank you so much for the talk and for showing those letters, revealing the very different perspectives that various Jews across the world had. I was wondering if you could also talk a little bit about the perspectives that Jews in Europe had post-World War II. I mean, it's Yom HaShoah today. And I was just wondering, within the displacement camps, within whatever life looked like post-World War II for Holocaust survivors, what Zionism looked like for them and how it played a role in their life.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. And the book does really look a lot at that, looks at especially propaganda that was disseminated in DP camps where Holocaust survivors were concentrated in the aftermath of World War II. And, you know, it reminds me a lot. Zionism, obviously today, is in a very different context, right, in what's going on in Gaza and the carnage there, etc. But, you know, for many people in many periods of time meant something very different. And, you know, even when I came to this country now 17 years ago, I was always often confused by the kind of attachment that I found, you know, for example, among some American Jews to Israel, because I often felt that the place that they were in their imagination talking about was very, very different than the place that I've researched and was a journalist for and lived in for the majority of my life. And you see a lot of that also in the immediate aftermath of World War II, right? So in those DP camps, you know, a lot of people are thinking and debating and where should they go next, right? Their old homeland are no longer a possibility, right? They've turned into a mass grave, right? And there's very little desire to return there. You know, U.S. is not necessarily accepting them, etc. And then you have, you know, State of Israel and the Zionist movement has a very concentrated campaign in those DP camps to try and convince Holocaust survivor to join the Israeli military in '48. And they disseminate basically a message, and you can see that in pamphlets, mostly in Yiddish, that I look at in my book, saying another Holocaust is taking place now in Palestine, in Israel, right? It's your job as a Holocaust survivor to come fight for your people, you know, even though you've just overcome, obviously, World War II, and to go and fight there. And people sometimes find this very, very compelling. In '48, 23,000 Jewish soldiers are Holocaust survivors. They're brought and immediately are drafted into the army. Others are you know, immigrating because, you know, they feel attached to that idea. Obviously, in the aftermath of World War II, the Zionist idea, which was a minority in among Jews up until World War II, right? So, you know, when it starts, it's almost could be seen as a sort of a fringe movement, and it only becomes an idea that is captivating to many at the end of World War II, because it's, for these people, it seems that obviously the Zionist idea have now been vindicated as a result of the extermination of most of European Jews in World War II. Many are attracted to this, and certainly the kind of propaganda disseminated in DP camps that a second Holocaust is supposedly taking place in Palestine helps galvanize those who end up drafting into the IDF in that year.
I suspect that my clock is stopped, so please everyone.
Take a couple more. Do we have time or no?
Maybe we'll take one more question.
Okay. I'm happy to stick around and answer.
Okay, please.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question was whether there was ever, you mentioned obviously reaction to the partition plan. I'm wondering whether there was ever a moment with the Jewish immigration to Palestine, perhaps prior to the Second World War, or maybe even after, where there was some thought of not partition, but coexistence, and whether that was ever a dominant strain. Obviously, we know that, you know, in this day and age, that seems less likely, but curious for your thoughts on that.
Certainly not a dominant strain, but absolutely. I mean, there was a strain in Zionism, often you know, associated with a movement known as Brit Shalom, and with people like Ahad Ha'am, a major Jewish thinker that was also associated with this idea that Zionism in Palestine should be what I call the light onto nation, that talked about a binational idea, right? That talked about Jewish immigration to Palestine, not for the purpose of exclusive sovereignty, but of something, certainly wasn't called like that at the time, but what we would probably refer to today as a one state, right, of equality. And those ideas ebbed and flow. It's interesting. One of those secretive units that I look at in the book, in the aftermath of the Palestinian exodus, right, the expulsion and fleeing of Palestinians, surveys the Jewish population what they think that should happen next. Should these Palestinians be allowed to return or not? They've been sliced the answers based on ethnicity. Can't remember the exact figures, but among Tel Aviv residents, right, the major metropolitan then and now, you had, I can't remember, I think slightly over 50% or something along that line that said, yeah, obviously those Palestinians that were it wasn't, the term expelled wasn't used, but that found themselves outside of Israel, obviously should be allowed to return, right? And envisioning a future that included the reversal of the effects of 48. Obviously, that's not where things have gone, but it may give us some indication that those ideas, and we see them also from the letters, were not outside the pale, right? In some ways, the discourse had radicalized much more, and those options of a less violent future seem to have become less feasible than the way that they were described in real time.
So thank you again, Shay, for this fascinating, comprehensive presentation. I would ask 1 minute for your time. We'd really appreciate it if you can please take a moment to provide feedback either through the online form, so you can scan the QR code to access the online feedback form, or if you would like to fill the form, which is just there on the table. We would really appreciate your feedback. Thank you again for coming. Our next talk of the series will take place on May 22nd on Zoom. You can find the Zoom link either on the Baptist Institute website or in the email that we will send out. So have a great rest of the evening.